Gonna talk some watches. Hey everyone, it's Mike from Just Watch, back with another episode. Today we're going to talk about purchasing vintage or used Rolexes. I'm kind of talking about a sweet spot here of like the last 20 years, just because some of the rules don't necessarily apply that I'm going to mention to some of your older timepieces, like a 5512 or something that was made in the late 1950s or early 1960s, something in the 40 plus year old range. You're not necessarily going to apply all of these standards. So just to clarify that, some of them you're definitely going to, some of the things that we're going to go into, like lug thickness, you definitely want to make sure you're still getting nice thick lugs with a watch, and we'll explain what that means as we go along. Anyways, let's dive right in. The first thing you want to consider is the watch 100% original. By that I mean the crystal, the handset, the dial. You want to make sure if you're buying the watch as a collector's item, you want to make sure that the watch is as close to original as possible. It's always okay if the watch has like a Rolex service dial or something along that lines, but as far as the watch maintaining its value, it's going to have the highest value if it's all original. Of course, anything that's older than 10 or 15 years old, you're probably going to have replaced parts within the movement. Just make sure that if the movement has been serviced, and hopefully it has, or that's another topic to speak about, if the movement has been serviced, that was serviced by a competent technician, and that they replaced any parts that needed replacing with genuine Rolex parts. If the watch is newer, I'm talking within the last 20 years, you're really hoping to get all original or as close to all original as possible. This is kind of what we were talking about in the intro. If the watch is 40, 50, 60 years old, it can be really hard to find an all original timepiece where the last 20 years or so you're hoping that it is all original. The handset is matching the dial as far as if there's any fade on the lume, things like that. So just make sure that the watch, before you buy, that's the first question you want to ask is the watch all original? Make sure that nothing has been replaced, especially with, if anything has been replaced, make sure that nothing has been replaced by aftermarket parts, that everything on the watch is genuine Rolex. The second question to ask is, when was the watch last serviced? This is important for any automatic mechanical watch that's older than about 5 to 10 years old, and especially important with Rolex because of the cost associated with repairing them. It's not uncommon for a full service for a Rolex to cost over $1,000, $1,500. So if you're buying a 10 or 12 year old Rolex Datejust and you're spending $3,000 to $3,500 on it, and you get it home, you notice it's running a little bit funny or a little bit wonky, and you bring it to your local watchmaker and he tells you it needs a full service, suddenly that Rolex isn't such a good deal. Next question to ask is, was the watch worn or was it stored? Or if it was worn, how often was it worn? Was it in a rotation, etc., etc.? Once again, this goes back to the servicing issue. If the watch was stored, if it's been sitting in a case for its entire life, for 5 years plus or even a year plus, what's happened is some of the lubricants that are inside the watch can actually dry up and gum up and actually cause issues with the watch when it starts being worn again. When it starts running, it can actually cause the tolerances within the gears to have problems. It can actually break things inside the watch. So make sure that if you have a watch that was sitting in storage for a long time, once again, you're going to want to get that to your local watchmaker and have it checked out, or hopefully better yet, the person that you're purchasing it from has done so already, or you're purchasing it from a reputable dealer who has gone through and checked the service on the movement and done any service necessary. That's actually the optimal deal there, is to make sure that the watch was serviced, that you're buying it from a reputable dealer that has done servicing on the watch. Next question to ask is the watch operating normally? Now this can mean a couple of things. First off, is the movement, how's the movement running? How is it keeping time? How strong is it running? Has it been on a time graph? But it also means the mechanical aspects of it, as far as, when you're operating the watch with a crown. First thing you want to do, if it's a Rolex, unscrew the crown, check out the hand winding. When you're hand winding the watch from the crown, it can be really indicative of what's going on with the watch. If it's too stiff, there's something going on. It shouldn't be too stiff, it shouldn't be too soft. You should definitely have that nice buttery feel that all Rolexes have when you're doing the hand winding. If it doesn't, there's probably a problem there. If it feels too stiff, that's often indicative of an issue within the movement. So definitely check that out. Also check out that, the clicking when you're pulling the watch out to that second stop and you're setting the time, or when you're in setting your date. Everything should feel smooth and normal, should operate as it should. There shouldn't be a lot of play when you're setting the time between the crown and the minute hand. The date should click over nice and smooth with a nice resounding click. And this, you can kind of feel things when they're off when you're setting the time and when you're setting the date. So definitely pay attention to that and definitely check that out. Also feel how it feels when you're screwing the crown back down in. You want to make sure that the threads feel good and solid, that it doesn't feel like it's cross-threaded or anything, and that it feels like, you're getting a nice firm seal. Of course, you can't tell how good the seal is, whether or not it's waterproof, until the watch is pressure tested by a watchmaker. So definitely keep that in mind, especially with older vintage watches. You might not want to wear that watch into the water until or unless it has been tested out, pressure tested, and or the seals have been replaced to bring it back to its full pressure rating. And we should actually talk about the pressure testing a little bit more. Bring the watch in to your local watchmaker or ask about it if the watch has been pressure tested. If the watch either hasn't or has failed that pressure test, you want to be careful, because the watch could have water inside the case, and once again, reputable dealer is going to have that case back open and check, make sure everything's okay, that there's no issues inside that case. And that's something that you want to make sure of as well if you're buying it from a private seller or from somebody that you know, or somebody that you don't know if you're buying it online, etc. Definitely make sure that the watch has been pressure tested, is still hopefully pressure sound as far as your water resistance goes, and that no water has made its way into that case. It's super important. It can cause a ton of damage to your watch. The next question to ask is, has the watch been polished? This is super important as well, especially with your more vintage watches, but even with the newer watches. What you don't want to run into is somebody getting hold of a watch that doesn't know what they're doing and just polishing the heck out of that brushed finish and making it look all shiny and polished looking, and not how the watch came from the factory. That actually hurts the retail value or the resale value of the watch down the line. And even worse, somebody gets a hold of the watch. Let's use a vintage Rolex 5513 Submariner as an example, and they've polished the heck out of those lugs to bring that mirror-like finish back on the case sides, to the point that the lugs are almost down to a point to the you have your spring bars almost protruding through and sticking out past the case. That's really bad, and that's not what you want. If you're looking at any of the Rolexes that have drill lug holes, definitely make sure that you have a little bit of depth, that you have to look down into the case to see those spring bar ends. If they're flush with the case, or even worse, sticking out of the case, that case has been really polished down, and that could be indicative that somebody got hold of the watch that didn't necessarily know what they're doing. So definitely be careful with that, and definitely avoid watches that have been really polished down. You see that a lot with vintage date just as well, like a 1630 and what have you, where they polish the heck out of them to the point where the lugs, which are already pretty thin to begin with, are almost ground down to a point. And that's one of the things. I actually purchased a watch from Becker Time in Texas and I returned it within, as soon as I got it, because as soon as, it's hard to tell in photos, as soon as I received it, I opened it up, I looked at it, I'm like, oh man, somebody ground the heck out of this thing. And they were great, as far as that goes. But I just wish that Rolex resellers would be a little bit more responsible with showing good, clear photos of the lugs and not trying to hide any flaws on the watch before purchase. That's something that everybody should do. They should, zoom in. And that's actually another tell that a reseller might not necessarily be using good practices and you might want to avoid. If they're not showing you those detailed photos of the lugs, of the case, with the case back off, with the bracelet off so you can see the model number and all that info inside, you might want to avoid them just because, they might be trying to hide something or pulling over on you. So definitely think about that and consider that when you're shopping for your new vintage watch. Now we should also talk about things to look for with a watch. We've already mentioned the polishing issue. Take a look at the dial. Make sure that the dial is intact. You want to make sure that, as far as from a collectible standpoint, that all of the lume plots are still there, that nothing is missing, that nothing looks like it's, none of the index markers are broken off. Or, I saw one recently online where the Rolex logo on the dial was completely missing. The applique white gold logo was just gone. It's just like, just how do they do that? How are they getting away with doing that? So take a look at that. If it's an older watch with tritium, take a look and see if the handset is matching the lume on the dial. The color should be approximately the same. I've seen a lot of watches where the handset has been replaced with a Rolex service handset, and it's just way newer looking than the dial, you know, it's still going to be okay. It's not going to be worth as much money as it would be if it was all original. Another thing to look for with a vintage Rolex on the bracelet is you want to see how much stretch the bracelet has. If you're buying a watch online and they're just showing you pictures but they're not showing you bracelet stretch, especially with the Jubilee bracelets, which stretch a lot, you definitely want to check that out. It's something that you want to know before you purchase. You know, how wearable is it? Is the bracelet likely to break? You know, can you imagine buying a $4,000 date just, vintage date just, and wearing it out the first day and the Jubilee bracelet breaks and your watch is gone because you didn't notice it falling off your wrist? I mean, those kind of things have happened, so definitely do consider that. Another good tip too, check out the sapphire crystal. It's pretty easy to see your scratches and nicks that are going to be on the older acrylic crystals. On a sapphire crystal, they tend to chip a little bit. And an easy way to tell, some of the chips can be very small, but an easy way to tell is just to run your fingernail around that edge of the crystal. And if there's a chip on it, your fingernail is going to hang up on it. That's one of the things that I like to do right off to check out the crystal. I've seen more than a few vintage Rolexes with sapphire crystals that have some pretty significant chips on the crystal that your eye doesn't necessarily pick up right away, but you definitely want to know about that. And it's just another question to ask too, is how intact, how clean is the crystal? Finally, I want to wrap this up by talking about expectations for the watch and what you plan to do with the watch. And I think that kind of predetermines what you're looking for as far as the overall quality of the watch. Of course, you always want the watch to be original, 100% original and fully functional, but you can kind of tweak that a little bit. Like if you're a collector and you're never going to wear the watch and you want to keep it as original as possible, you don't want to service it, you don't really care if it's water resistant 100% because you're not planning on giving it any significant wrist time, that's a whole different thing than, you know, somebody that's buying a 14060 Submariner, a 2-liner, and wants to wear it daily and, you know, wants to make sure that they can go in the water and everything else. If you're that guy and you're out buying that Submariner, definitely make sure that you're getting it to your local watchmaker, that everything is intact, the crystal's in great shape, the crown is good, your seals are intact, that it's been pressure tested, and that the movement is running as it should. You know, it's just pretty simple. It's just like an automobile. If it's something that's going to be your daily driver, you just want to make sure that you can rely on it and you don't have to worry about it breaking down, and that you're not going to cause any damage to the watch that could be expensive down the road. You know, watch collecting is really fun. Wearing vintage watches is awesome. We all love them. That's why we're here. And I just want to help you guys as far as making smart choices and making good purchases. Speaking of making good purchases and smart choices, there's definitely some really good online retailers that you can purchase from who definitely go through and service their timepieces before they sell them. I've dealt with two over the last few months, namely HQ MIlton in San Francisco and Bob's in Long Beach, California, I believe. I'll give you guys links down in the show notes below if you want to go check out their used inventory. Everybody, thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate having you along, and we'll be back soon with another episode. All right, everybody. Bye-bye.